Okay, this is going to be your review for your slope standard form and slope intercept form test that is coming up. We actually completed this activity today in class together, but I wanted to make sure that everyone understood how to work all of these problems. So if you have your activity, go ahead and get it out. And if you don't have your activity, then this is uploaded onto iTunes U, so you could look at it there, or you can follow along with what I'm doing. So if you look at number 1, it says to find the slope of the following graph. Well, as soon as you saw a graph and you knew that you were finding slope, you should be thinking about the slope triangle. So remember, the slope triangle is when you have 2 points on a graph, like we have here. We can simply use the rise over run, or the change in y over change in x, by drawing a triangle on the graph. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this point, and I'm going to draw a line going down so that I can see how many I would have to move down. So remember, if you're changing y, if you're moving in a downward motion, it would be negative. And I'm just going to count. I would have to move 1, 2, 3 places to get in line with the next point. So I know my top number of my rate of change, or my slope, is -3. Then I'm going to look at how many I would need to move over to get to that point. And I move 1 to the right, so that makes my bottom number of my ratio 1. So that makes the slope of this line -3. Now remember, we talked about if a line slopes down from left to right, then your slope should be a negative number, which this one is, so I know that I did this correctly. Okay? If you are struggling with slope, remember I have videos posted for slope, so you could go back and watch those. Okay, so let's look at the next one. So on this one, it asks you to find the slope of the following graph. Well, notice this line is horizontal. So hopefully as soon as you saw a horizontal line, you thought, oh, it's hoi. Because remember, horizontal lines, that's what H stands for, horizontal, have 0 slope, and those equations are written y equals a number. Okay? So the slope of this line, since it is horizontal, would be 0. Okay? All right. Now, if you look at number 3, for number 3, it's actually asking you for the slope formula. So we've talked about slope in a lot of different ways, but remember, the slope formula is how do you find the change in y over the change in x? You just subtract. You subtract y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. When you're actually counting on a graph, you're actually performing subtraction. Remember, we did this using a number line. I asked you how many spaces would you have to move to get from this number to this number. Okay, so I'm actually going to do that here on number 4 to help you remember. So it asked you to find the slope between the ordered pairs. So it gave me 2 points, and I'm going to be using this formula. And remember, there's 2 ways you can do this. You can simply look and ask yourself, how do I get from -5 to +1? Well, to get from -5 to +1, that would be going +6. So I know my change in y would be 6. Then you're looking at, how do I get from -7 to -3? Well, I would have to move +4. So my change in x would be 4. And then that reduces to 3/2. Now, if you're struggling trying to figure out, well, I don't really know how to go from -5 to 1, that's when the subtraction comes in. Okay? So I'm going to use this formula right here and show you the same math. So if I do 1 minus -5, that's y2, because this would be my second y, minus y1. So if I subtract 1 minus -5, I get 6. than if you do your x2 minus x1. So if I had -3 minus -7, I would wind up getting 4. So do you see how 6 over 4 and 6 over 4 are the same thing? With the formula, you have to know your integer rules, and you have to be able to perform that subtraction. If you just ask yourself on a number line, if I'm standing on -5 and I'm going to walk to +1, how many steps would I take? I would take 6 steps to the right or up. If I'm going from -7 to -3, well, -7's here and -3 is here, I would have to walk 4 steps. So that's where this +4 came from. Okay, so you can do distance by just looking at it and thinking of a number line, or you can actually use the formula and perform the subtraction. It doesn't matter, you're going to get the same answer. Okay. Let's go ahead and try another one. So looking at number 5, how do I get from 5 to -2? That represents my change in y. So if I'm standing on 5 and I'm walking to -2, I would have to move down 7. So that is a -7. Then how do I get from 4 to 4? Well, if I'm on 4 and I'm trying to get to 4, I don't have to move, so that is 0. Now remember, I told you guys, if 0's on the bottom, it's bad. So 0 on the bottom, undefined. This has an undefined slope. You cannot divide by 0. Remember, if 0 is underneath, then your answer is undefined. Okay, so that can help you remember. 0 is underneath, then your slope is undefined. Okay? All right. We spent several days talking about slope-intercept form. So remember, slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Okay? Slope-intercept, m represents your slope, b represents your y-intercept. In standard form, we have ax plus by equals c. Okay? Remember, in standard form, a and b cannot both be 0. Okay? So we have our slope-intercept form. That's where I can see my slope is m, or the number in front of x, and my y-intercept is b, or the number being added and subtracted. Remember, standard form we use to find our intercepts. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at number 7. It says convert the equation to slope-intercept form. So as soon as I see the word slope-intercept form, I know that I'm wanting to write this as y equals mx plus b. Okay? So looking at this problem, if I'm trying to get y by itself, step 1 is to subtract 4x from both sides. Because how I move something is by doing the opposite of what's being done. So I have 3y equals -4x plus 15. Step 2, the opposite of multiplying by 3 would be to divide by 3. Those cancel, and remember, over here I have to divide that by 3 and that. So I can't actually divide -4 by 3 evenly, so I leave it as -4 over 3x, and then 15 divided by 3 is 5. So I know that in slope-intercept form, this would be -4/3 x plus 5. So remember here, if they asked you, your slope would be -4/3, and your y-intercept would be 5. Okay? For number 8, once again, they want you to convert to slope-intercept form, so they're trying to get it into y equals mx plus b. So step 1, I want to move this positive x to the other side by subtracting. Those are going to cancel, and I get -2y equals -x plus 2. Then the opposite of multiplying by -2 would be to divide by -2. Those cancel. Now remember, here, when I divide a negative by a -2, it's going to be positive half x. And when I divide a positive 2 by a -2, I'm going to get -1. Okay? So in slope-intercept form, that would be y equals half x minus 1. If they asked you, your slope would be half, your y-intercept would be -1. Now we have the opportunity to use slope-intercept form to actually graph. So remember, there's a couple of steps for this. The first thing that you want to do is go ahead and identify your slope and your y-intercept. So remember, your slope is the number in front of x, so this is 5 over 2. And your y-intercept is the number being added or subtracted, so in this case it's negative 4. Once you identify your slope and y-intercept, all you have to do is put them on the coordinate plane. So step 1 is to graph that y-intercept. So I'm going to go down to negative 4 on the y-axis, and I'm going to put a point. Then I'm going to, remember, slope is rise over run. So I'm going to rise 5, run 2, and I'm going to put a point. So what I did is I started on my y-intercept. I went up 5 because 5 was positive, and then I went right 2 because 2 was positive. Now that I have 2 points, I'm going to take something straight, and I'm going to draw my line through them. Okay? The last thing you should check is make sure, is my slope positive? Yes. Does my line slope up when I look at it from left to right? And the answer is yes. Then you can make sure that's touching at negative 4. You've done your checks. You know you did it right. All right, so let's look at number 10. Here, when I identify my slope, I can see it right there. It's negative 2. If you want to write that as negative 2 over 1, since you know you're going to be using it to graph, I would go ahead and do that. B, I can see right here, is 7. So step 1, plot your y-intercept. So I am going to put a point on 7 on the y-axis. Then I'm going to use my slope, which is negative 2 over 1. So I go down 2 and over 1 to get my next point. Okay? Since 2 was negative, that's why I went down and to the right 1 because 1 was positive. Then you take something straight, and you're going to go ahead and draw your line through your points. For your last check, make sure my slope is negative, my line slopes down. My y-intercept is 7, it's touching y at 7. Okay, now for number 11 and 12, it asks you to graph them using slope-intercept form. So if it asks you specifically to use slope-intercept form, go ahead and use that. So step 1 would be to rewrite it in slope-intercept form. So for number 11, I would need to subtract x from both sides, and that would give me y equals negative x minus 5. Now I can do the same thing that I was doing before. I know that my slope, since this is negative x, my slope was negative 1. B is right there, it's negative 5. So I'm going to start by putting a point on negative 5 on the y-axis. This time my slope was negative 1, so I'm going to go down 1 and to the right 1. Remember, your top number was negative, so I went down, but my bottom number was positive, so I went right. Then you take something straight, and you draw a line through those points. When I look at it, I notice slope is negative, line slopes down. Y-intercept is negative 5, it's touching at negative 5. Okay, let's go ahead and do number 12. On this one, step 1, since it is asking for slope-intercept form, I'm going to subtract x from both sides. I'm going to bring down my negative 3y, so I have negative x minus 6. Then I need to divide everything by negative 3 because y was not by itself. Negative x divided by negative 3 is going to become positive 1/3 x, and negative 6 divided by negative 3 is going to become positive 2. My slope is 1/3. It's right there in front of x. My y-intercept right there is going to be 2. In order to graph that, I'm going to go to 2 on the y-axis and put a point. I'm going to rise 1 and run 3 and put another point. And remember, you can repeat that process a couple of times just to make sure that your line is accurate. Since I'm doing this on my iPad, you can see here when I drew my line, I'm slightly off. That's why I encourage you to use a straight edge in class. It doesn't have to be a ruler. It could be your ID. It could be the edge of a piece of paper, anything that's straight, just to make sure our line is accurate. I notice my slope is positive 1/3. This slopes up. I notice my y-intercept is 2, so I double check, and yes, my line should be crossing at 2 on the y-axis. For number 13, we get to practice Vux Hoy, so let's review that. right away when I noticed that this equation was x equals, I knew that I was looking at VUX. Remember, V stands for vertical lines. The U stands for undefined slope. And then the x reminds me that my equation would be written x equals a number, which in this case, what does x equal? It equals -1. So on the x-axis, I'm going to go to -1 and put a point. And I already know because it's VUX, it is vertical, so I'm going to draw a vertical line through that point. Okay. Looking at the second problem on this one, it says y equals, so I know that had to be HOI. So remember, HOI, the H stands for horizontal lines. The 0 stands for have zero slope. And the y is supposed to help me remember that those equations are written y equals a number. In this case, what does y equal? It equals 4. So I go to 4 on my y-axis and I put a point. This is a HOI, so that means it's a horizontal line through that point. All right, for the very last problem, this was the last concept that we kind of touched on briefly that we're going to be doing more in the next couple of weeks. So it asked me to identify the x and y intercepts of the equation and then graph. So notice this is in standard form. I can use standard form to find intercepts, okay? If it's an intercept, then that means that it has to be on the x or y axis. So if you think about it, if I'm looking for the x-intercept, if I'm on the x-axis, that means that y had to be equal to 0. So to find my x-intercept, all I have to do is put a 0 in for y. Well, when I do that, this value is going to go away. So I'm left with 3x equals 24. Okay? So let's think about that for just a second. If I have 3x equals 24, I can find my x-intercept by solving that equation. I just divide both sides by 3, and then I find out that x had to be equal to 8. So my x-intercept had to be 8, 0, because that's how I got rid of y. I put a 0 in for y. So I can go ahead and graph that. I can go on the x-axis, and I can put a point on 8. That's the y-axis. Let's go ahead to the x-axis and put a point on 8. Then I can do the same thing to find my y-intercept. So if you think about it, if I'm looking at the y-intercept, if I'm on y, 0 had to be x. I couldn't have moved left or right. I had to start at 0 and then go up or go down. So can't I just put a 0 in for x and solve? Well, if I put a 0 right there, I'm left with -4y equals 24. So if I have -4y equals 24, I just divide both sides by -4, and I find out that my y had to be equal to -6. So that makes my y-intercept 0, -6. So if I stay on 0, I go down -6, and I put a point. Now I have 2 points. All I have to do is draw a line through them. My x-intercept occurred at 8, 0. I can see it. It's touching the graph right there. And my y-intercept occurred at 0, -6. And we will be doing more practice on this, okay? So go ahead and make sure you study for your test. If you have questions, you can go back and rewatch this video. You can watch a previous video. You can look over the work that we've done, but come prepared tomorrow so that you can be successful. I will see you then.